I'm lucky enough to have Dylan Solati from Davidas Finance. Dylan, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks, Gianni. Thank you for having me. Hello, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you, mate. Look, we're talking first home buyers. Now, I'd love to be able to go through with you, considering your years of financial experience as a mortgage broker, just some of the considerations around first home buyers. And at the moment, we find that there's a lot of people tossing up between going owner occupied and going down the rentvestor route, so renting and investing. And it's even made the headline news lately. Even I saw recently Channel 9 News made an update around, why people are moving towards this. What are some of the considerations when people are deciding between going down the owner-occupied principal place of residence and the rentvestor route?
Yeah, good question. Look, obviously, I wanted to sort of, I guess, kick off to say that this particular conundrum of, buying an owner-occupied versus the rent vesting route, it is, I've been doing this a bit over 10 years now, and it is a constant, particularly for younger borrowers, first time into the market, trying to work out, set themselves up, depending on where you're living and wanting to buy in the country, the challenges that we're faced with obviously Australian property and the headlines that you touched on and the affordability that is obviously, unfortunately, for the moment, only becoming worse and tougher and more challenging to get into the market. So it's a constant reminder that and situation that a lot of borrowers find themselves in. So if you're on here tonight, understand that it is firstly extremely common. A couple of the, I guess, main questions or criteria or how we kind of guide clients through is, look, at the end of the day, you really still need to sort of work out your long-term motivation. Whenever we talk property, in my thought process, and I'm sure you possibly agree with me, Gianni, property is generally should be considered as a long-term investment. Okay, so what is going to suit our goals over the at least medium to long term, and really anything when you're looking less than 5 to 7 years, it does get a bit tricky because you may end up not getting the results that you want. So always trying to work out what is my sort of long-term driver or motivator for me to obviously transact in this first property. Now, of course, if you knew that, you probably wouldn't be tuning into this conversation right now, and it's probably not that helpful. So then we obviously start there, of course, and then when it's not quite clear or you're not sure or you want to understand your options, then of course you then need to go on to the next series of questions and qualifying criteria. And the next place, the best place to start, if you're still unsure as to what is your ultimate driver, is of course understanding your options. And no better place to start, which if you are considering obviously buying, and of course you are a first home buyer, then you need to understand what are the actual benefits as a first home buyer that are applicable to your specific situation. So again, depending on where you're tuning in from across the country, the state, there's a number of federal government grants and schemes. Just to rattle off a few, there's obviously the low deposit scheme. There's a bunch of first homeowner grants. There's a new affordability scheme where the government guarantees up to 30-40% for low income earners. There's the super saver scheme. There's even a few other schemes that even sometimes you kind of forget about that are actually there from a federal level. And some of them are fairly underutilized and not very well publicized, but they're out there. So speaking to a broker, doing your research, they're all online, easy to find out. Is quite easy to find out the information. And then if you're unsure if they definitely qualify for you, then speaking to a good mortgage broker or speaking directly to those particular institutions can obviously streamline that. And then you go to a state level. So depending on if you're in New South Wales, Queensland, or across the country in WA, each state-based Each state is going to have different first home buyer benefits. Typically, they will consist of some sort of stamp duty waiver up to a certain threshold where you don't have to pay that stamp duty that's applicable. And then you have, if you're buying newer property up to a certain threshold, you'll have grants where they actually, rebate or give you additional funding towards the contribution of the property. The other thing is these grants and things, they go up, they go down, they change, they're constant. Even myself, constantly having to keep up with it can be a lot of information. But at the end of the day, starting there can all be immediately one of the biggest impacts to help drive the decision. And what I mean by that is at the end of the day, if you find out that because either you earn too much money or you want to buy a property that's above the threshold and you get no benefits, then immediately, if you're buying or one of your main drivers to buy owner occupied is to take advantage of the first home buyer benefits, then you already are kind of starting to eliminate that, if that is my main driver and I don't actually apply or applicable to those benefits, then that's obviously a lot of information. So understanding what are the benefits there, because ultimately that'll help sway your information.
So the benefit there is removing some of those barriers to entry around getting into a property, purchasing a property. And those first home buyer grants and schemes are typically aimed at owner occupier. Is that part of the equation when it comes to looking at owner occupied property?
Correct. Again, one of the big draw cards to the on owner occupied conversation is if you are in that category that you do qualify for not just one but multiple of the grants, you can find that the disparity between something like the amount of deposit that you need to get into the property plus purchase costs that are associated, that stamp duty being the big one. So at the end of the day, if you were to hypothetically qualify for stamp duty waiver on, again, if you're in New South Wales, an example, up to 800,000, nearly a $30,000 wipe out of the stamp duty, which is a big one. If you were to be able to qualify for the low deposit scheme, the federal scheme, where you only need a 5% deposit, you get 80% interest rates, great rates, and of course, not having to pay mortgage insurance. Then the cost to buy the $800,000 owner occupied property, as an example, is about $40,000 plus maybe an extra couple of grand in purchase cost. Versus if you're going to buy an $800,000 investment property, you're typically looking at 10 to 12 minimum contribution plus another 30,000 on top there. So let's call that, circa 130, give or take. So there's a massive difference between the deposit requirements on a first home buyer that qualifies for all the schemes versus the investment property. So if you've got very little capital or deposit to begin with, then no point having this aspiration of buying an $800,000 investment property if all you've got to play with is $60,000 and you can qualify. Then again, it's all got to be sort of considered into what are my options, and then therefore what is my main driver of the purchase. So that's a big one, is understanding what you actually qualify for, what you're trying to underachieve.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, look, a lot of upfront considerations there, but then there's also ongoing considerations. So, with investment property, there might be land tax applicable. There's, property management costs that are applicable. There's also a number of ongoing cost considerations as well associated with owning the property down the track. How did they impact first-time buyers?
Yeah, so correct. Obviously, from affordability piece and borrowing capacity standpoint, of course, a big indicator of is sometimes the affordability piece for particularly someone enjoying a certain type of lifestyle versus the borrowing capacity as seen by the lenders, depending on your situation and circumstances. Sometimes it can be higher, sometimes it can be a bit lower. Ultimately, it just depends on what the affordability and the particular clients are trying to achieve to determine, where they should stand. And of course, you do need to understand the true running costs. Now, if you're buying for owner occupied, you've got the mortgage. Like you said, there's other ongoing costs that are also associated. And then, of course, if you're running an investment property, you do have the ongoing costs of additional to rates and council and strata if it's applicable of property management. Typically, if you're going to have a property manager and maintenance and any other costs that are associated, which of course is just all tied in around the negative to positive gearing conversation as well. So really, again, a big piece understanding what you qualify for is then understanding what your affordability is. And oftentimes we'll actually start, particularly with our first time buyers and investors, of what are you currently saving at the moment? What do you think you can afford? And what have you budgeted for? Okay, we have those three questions before we even tell them what their max borrowing is, because at the end of the day, there's not an alignment with all those three. It's the only way to truly help them make sure that they're either not borrowing too much and or they've shown capacity to be able to afford it on an ongoing basis. So really important part of the piece to make sure that we're not putting anyone into sort of financial pressure. And I think it probably ties in well with a common misconception around the borrowing capacity. And, oftentimes so many people will just come with the flat notion that borrowing capacity for investment property, you're going to have a higher borrowing capacity. And look, generally speaking, at the end of the day, if someone's paying rent back to you, that's covering a fair portion of the mortgage. So in that just initial thought process, that makes a lot of sense. However, the biggest thing, of course, is each lender will have their own lending criteria and parameters. And probably the biggest key component is if you're going to be buying for investing, the rent vesting part, then what is your rental commitment or living or housing situation? Because at the end of the day, if you're fortunate enough where you're still, residing at home, you're quite a young buyer, residing at home with mum and dad, trying to get yourself onto the property ladder, like a lot of young Australians are, then yes, your borrowing capacity to buy an investment property where you have little to no rental commitment is going to be substantially higher. Okay. If you happen to be already renting in the eastern suburbs of Sydney or some of the premier suburbs in some of our capital cities where rental is quite high, then, potentially if your rental commitment is a lot higher than your rental proposal, then the borrowing capacity may not look as healthy as an investment property. So it's a common misconception. And again, it's a big, big component to help a person understand which way they should go is to understand their borrowing capacity. So oftentimes we will take someone's financial situation and then be able to workshop with them and say, well, look, if you were to buy an investment property, with the money that you have and the estimated rental that you would get, depending on that strategy, then your borrowing is going to be, somewhere in the range of about 700 to 750 as an example. But for that exact same person, if you were to buy an owner-occupied situation, your borrowing becomes 500 to 600. And then typically we would send them off to do their due diligence, which of course they might chat with you or they might do research, where the conversation then becomes, well, what can I actually buy with my situation for 500 to 600 in the areas that I'm considering as an owner occupied? Okay. And then what are my options buying for 700 to 750 as an investment property, continuing to live in those things? So oftentimes the borrowing capacity piece and the difference between your specific situation and what those two avenues will oftentimes help people then work out the path of which way to go.
Yeah, because at the end of the day, it comes to a couple of things. It comes to what is their specific goal? Is their goal to buy an owner occupied? Because some people just want that sense of comfort or security of owning their own home. Other people want to create wealth through purchasing an investment property. And then some people, when it goes to purchasing an owner occupied property, they don't like the actual asset. They don't see themselves living in a home like that or a home that they can afford. Therefore, they decide to go down the rentvestor route because they don't like the quality of the actual asset that they're buying as an owner occupied as well.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, like, again, it's just so great to have someone like yourself to be able to guide people, particularly for our clients, to be able to guide them through just the options and the performance of the dwelling. Because again, so many times we will get, this stepping stone approach, right? And what I mean by that is clients will often say, well, I have this opportunity to, go live in a property, take advantage of the home buyer benefits, where essentially, as I sort of mentioned, in New South Wales, well, Sydney, for an $800,000 purchase, you can get in with sort of 40 to 45 grand. Now that's an incredible opportunity. Live in it, of course, for 12 months. Then you might move back after it, which you're legally allowed to do after that time period. And then they might rent it out, or they have this stepping stone approach of like, well, I'm only going to buy it as a methodology to get to the dream house. Of course, we would all love to buy the dream house from day one, but if it's not an option, then you've got to get in the market so that the market and leverage is your friend, to then upsize and sort of go through that way. So the performance and understanding the performance, if that stepping stone approach is what you're trying to do, then understanding whether it's owner occupied or investment, the growth, performance, and potential becomes so much more critical, because if you don't get that right, then your plans, okay, then all of a sudden you've overcommitted, you've gone into the market with an underperforming property that hasn't gone up. And if you've gone down the owner occupied route, potentially in an area that you don't really want to live in, and then you kind of get stuck in this. So I do see some clients that maybe they get the finance, they've got the strategy, they've got the clear goal and mindset, but then they don't quite get it right on the property purchase. And then that stepping stone can go a bit awry, and we sort of track it, year 2, year 3, year 4, and they haven't got that performance that they wanted. And I've seen it on the other side of things where they get the advice, they buy well, and they're all of a sudden into that next level up within 3 or 4 or 5 years sometimes.
Yeah.
So it's a
It,
really,
it it definitely is about asset selection. And yes, if you limit your purchase to where you want to live, you're excluding thousands of other markets across Australia as well. So particularly, a lot of people will only buy in Sydney. Let's say, for example, if I live in Sydney, I will only buy in Sydney as an owner occupied just to take advantage of all those grants that are available to me. And that being said, at the same time, you might be shooting yourself in the foot, because either there's an area with better potential that might have more potential for capital growth, or even worse, that asset might not perform and it'll actually shoot you in the foot for future, for performance wise. So
exactly.
I tell people, if it's
It-
performance based, then yeah, keep your an open mind in terms of
and that's
location.
what I mean. Like, especially if you see it, and again, we're not encouraging or condoning any sort of sort of gaming of the system or anything like that. But you do
Mm.
see it with clients, like I said, that trying to, rightfully so, take the opportunities that they're to help them grow perhaps a portfolio, and legally do so, where and living in and residing in the property for the required period. But I've seen it go wrong as well, like you said, just trying to basically take advantage of this to fit a strategy with that doesn't align with the longer term goal. And that's why I started with the long term goal and plan. Because if the long term driver is building wealth through property, then that short term, just going to take advantage of this and buy the wrong asset, on the long term can make a huge impact. Because I've seen, like you said, and it's like, oh, Sydney always goes up. No, I've seen people buying high-rise apartments because it's under 800, 3 or 4 years ago, and they're still the same, and they've gone back up, very little in that time, and they're some kind of, you know, underwhelmed, unfortunately, in that side of things. And I think particularly if we talk about New South Wales, the with the length of time being that you have to reside in it for 12 months, it can be more of a disruption to your life, your actual life. Um, and depending on your solution, financially, particularly if you're on a high paying job in a higher tax bracket, I've done the numbers. You're better off paying the rent, and getting the gearing benefits and living in the eastern suburbs and enjoying your life, than worrying about sort of in those considerations. So it's an interesting one, but the guys there, like you said, asset selection, long term viewpoint is super critical. Again, I still see so many young families and people where, you know, buying the owner occupied route still makes a lot of sense for their security, their needs, their family. You know, that's the driver. But those guys out there that are more focused on building wealth through property, like I said, particularly if you're now in a higher income earner, generally speaking, my advice is just focus on the investor lane. You know what I
Mm.
mean? It's not as lucrative. The numbers, you kind of break pretty even after the stamp duty. If you can afford it and you have the capital, you know, take advantage, focus on the investment route, and you will be better off getting the right asset the first time as opposed to just trying to you know, bypass and take a short-term solution.
100%. Yeah, I think if there's ever one takeaway from our discussion, it's don't go down the first homeowners route, owner occupied route, just for the sake of taking advantage of the grant. And yeah, so look, on the back of that, I want to encourage everybody. None of what we've talked about is financial advice as well. Strongly suggest that if you are considering going down either route and you're not quite sure, seek out the advice of a financial planner. In terms of mortgage broking and property selection, please reach out to Dylan or myself. And what I'll ask is, Dylan, if you can put your details in the comments so that people can get in touch with you if they do have any questions or if they want to go down the pre-approval route as well.
Sure.
Apart from that,
Yeah,
sorry, mate.
I'll put my comments in there, and then I did an article recently, about a week and a half ago, just updating all of our clients around the latest state by state grants. So I'll put that in the chat as well if anyone finds that information useful.
Awesome. That'll be perfect. Thank you so much, mate. So look, Dylan, really appreciate your time and yeah, thank you for joining us to have an in-depth discussion.
All right, thank you.